I'm Mrs. Princey, Associate Professor in Mental Health Nursing. When the doctor wants to diagnose a medical condition or a medical disorder, the patient has to undergo the various investigations or assessment in terms of the physical examination to aid in the diagnosis of the condition and also to plan the treatment, right? So when you take a psychiatric disorder, when there is a psychiatric patient, we need to plan the treatment for the condition. We need to diagnose the condition. Unlike the medical condition, we cannot do the physical examination and ask the patient to undergo other investigations, right? So it's very, very important when it comes to a psychiatric disorder. The psychiatrist or the clinical psychologist will ask the client to undergo some tests, right? So these tests are nothing but the psychological tests which are going to aid them in the diagnosis and also to plan the treatment. Yes, so today the topic which I'm going to discuss is the various psychological tests and the role of nurse in the psychological tests. Let us see the meaning of the psychological test. Psychological tests are the standardized measure which are devised to assess the behavior of an individual. It helps the psychologist as well as the client to understand about their behavior and to know more about themselves. Okay, so that is the psychological test where we have various psychological tests. Okay, so we are going to see what are the types of the psychological tests. So based on the various categories, okay, can group the psychological tests. The first one is the classification of the psychological test based on the construction and administration of the psychological test. So in that, number one, we have got the individual and the group test. So as the name says, the individual and the group test. The psychological test will be constructed in terms of a particular individual, and it will be given to one person. Okay, that is an individual psychological test which is administered to one person. When it comes to group psychological tests, so people who are having the similar disorders, okay, they'll be given the psychological test in a group. So that is called as the group psychological test, wherein the administration of the psychological test is done in the group. Yes. The next type of the psychological test is the speed and the power test. In the speed and the power test, okay, here we are going to assess how fast the client is able to give the answer and what is his intellectual strength in terms of the answers what he will give, right? So that is about the speed and the power test which are administered to the client. All these psychological tests are the standardized tests which will be used by the psychologists throughout the world. So wherever you go, the standardized format is available for a particular test, okay, to assess a particular criteria, and these tests will give the inferences and we can do the interpretation of the result. The next type of the psychological test is the computer assisted test. So what is this computer assisted test? As the name says, the psychological test will be administered via the computer. Through the assistance of the computer through the system, the psychological test will be administered to the client, and client can give the response and the psychologist and the psychiatrist can do the interpretation. The next test is the paper and pencil performance test. So here the client is given a questionnaire or a set of the questions where he has to give a response in terms of checklist or in terms of rating scales, right? So he has to give the answers or his responses in the paper and pencil method, and also the performance of the client will be assessed at the end of the psychological test. So these are the psychological tests which is based on the construction and administration of the test. The next category of the psychological test is based on the knowledge skills and abilities of the client, of an individual. So based on that, the psychological test will be administered. So we have got various tests to assess the knowledge of an individual or the skill or the ability of a person. So let us see what are these tests. The first one is the achievement test. So if we call these as end term examination, right? At the end of the term of a particular course, we do the assessment or we do the evaluation to find out how far the student is able to perform, how far the student is able to achieve a particular degree. So here also the achievement tests are administered to find out the ability of an individual. The next test is the aptitude test, which includes the general aptitude test battery. So in this particular test, the skills of an individual will be assessed. So what kind of a skill he possesses. So based on the type of the assessment what we want to do, these tests, aptitude tests will be administered to find out what are the skills that the individual is possessing. The next test is the intelligence test. Okay, intelligence test is one of these tests which are very much used to find out the IQ of an individual, the intellectual ability of a person. So here we have got the various tests like Stanford Binet intelligence test scale. Then we have got Wessler's intelligence test for adults, Wessler's intelligence test for children. So like that, based on the age group, we have got some standardized forms which will be helpful in assessing the intellectual ability of an individual. The next test is the interest test. So in the interest test, we have got the interest inventory. So what is the interest of an individual? So we have got an inventory scale wherein the individual has to give a response as to what is his interest. So we will be doing the interpretation. So that is the interest test. So the next test is the neuropsychological test. So here we are using Wessler's adult memory scale. So to find out the neuropsychological aspect of an individual, the memory in terms of the cognition, in terms of the memory, we'll be giving some standardized forms. One of these examples is Wessler's memory scale to assess the neuropsychological function of an individual. The next type of the test is the occupational test. One of the example is the McWeck's occupational test. So why this occupational test is being administered? To find out whether the individual will actually fit into a particular occupation or not, right? So before a person gets into a occupation or a vocation, he has to undergo certain kind of the psychological test to find out the fitness of an individual. So in those conditions, we'll be giving the occupational test. Say for example, in case of a military department and soldiers, okay, even they have to have the control over their emotions or mental ability. In that scenario, these occupational tests, one of the psychological tests also is the aspect in the recruitment of the staffs to a particular occupation. So that is the occupational test. The next type of the test is the personality test. So when it comes to a personality test, we are using these tests to find out the type of the personality the individual is possessing. So we have got various personality tests that we can use, right? Through the observation, through the interview, through the objectivity, we are able to find out what is the personality of an individual. So apart from these, we have got the projective tests, right? Very important. We are using in the personality test. We have got the projective techniques. Okay, one of these examples for the personality test is the Rorschach's ink blot test. So based on the ink blots, whatever is standardized form which is given, right, by the Rorschach's ink blot test, the individual has to interpret the images. Likewise, we have got the other psychological tests like thematic perception test, child perception test. So like that, we have got multiple personality Minnesota test. So 16-factor personality test. So like the various personality tests that we have to assess the personality of an individual. The next test is a specific clinical test. So in the psychiatric condition, there are times where in the physiology of an individual will be disturbed. Okay, so in those conditions, we will administer some specific clinical tests. One of those examples is Pittsburgh's Sleep Quality Index test. So here we are going to assess the quality of the sleep of the client. So by administering this special type of the clinical test. So these are the various psychological tests that we'll be using in the field of psychiatry to do the assessment and also to plan the treatment. Moving on to the development of the psychological tests. So how these psychological tests, what I'm saying is standardized measures which are used universally to assess the ability or the skill or the knowledge or the personality of an individual. Yes, how are these developed? So we have got a series of steps as to how these psychological tests or the standardized forms are developed. So let us see in detail about each. The first one is the analysis of the situation. So what is this analysis of the situation? So we have to analyze the situation of the client. So we may have to collect the baseline data. We may have to collect the history of the client to know what is the situation around the client, right? When knowing the history of the client, we will try to find out or assume, or we can just predict what are the problems of the client and what kind of a test that he may has to undergo for the actual diagnosis. The next step is the tentative selection of the test items. So here in this particular test, tentatively we will select certain items for the test. So certain forms of test or psychological test that we may tentatively select for the client to undergo the test. So we can say it is like a planning process. We are planning and we are finding out what are the tests which can suit this particular situation. The next step is development of standardized procedure. So based on the assessment of the situation and the tentative plan of the test that we have selected, we have to develop the standardized procedure to undergo the process of the psychological test. So what is the procedure? How can we move about in the process of the psychological test? So that is being understood in the development of the standardized procedures to undergo the psychological test. The next step is the administration of this standardized test to the representation group. Or so we can say that a small group of sample will be selected, wherein the testing will be done on this group to find out how effective these psychological test can be made use of, right? So we will be administering this psychological test as a pilot study on a small representative sample of the population. The next step is the final selection of the test items, or we can say the item analysis. So after administration of the test on the small representative group, we will finalize. So these are the we'll come to know whether these particular items in this test will be matching or will it be appropriate to the situation or not, right? So we will be doing the final selection of the items or the questions for the standardized test. The last step is the evaluation of the final test. So once we have completed all these processes, we have assessed the situation, we have tentatively selected or planned the items for the test, then we have planned the what is the procedure that we need to undergo, then we have administered the test to a small representative population, then finally we are doing the item analysis. The last step is the evaluation of the final test. So we are finally going to come to an end whether the particular standardized form whatever we have made, will it be appropriate, is it accurate, can it be generalized? So that is done in the evaluation. So if there are any limitations or any drawbacks, those things can be corrected, and the final standardized form of the psychological test can be brought about. So this is the development of the psychological test. Moving on to the principles of the psychological test. So when we administer the psychological test, it's very, very important that we have to keep in mind certain set of rules or the regulations. We can say the principles that we need to follow. What are those? Number one is that the psychological test should include three main components. What are those three main components? The first one is the standard, the second is the content, and the third one is the procedure of administering this psychological test to any individual at any time period. That means whatever the psychological test that is being developed, it should be a standard one. Okay, it should have the content for assessing the particular trait, and also it should be the one which can be used by any individual at any time to be administered. So this is the foremost important principle of the psychological test. The second principle is the psychological test should have a norm of the individual test score, which has to be compared with the group which has already taken the test. So what it means, earlier we should have a norm to compare the whatever the individual score is with the group of people who have already underwent the test. So that is the second principle of the psychological test. The third principle is the items which are there in the psychological test should be of a high quality, which has to be prepared by the experts in the field of inquiry, and it has to be pre-tested, and also it has to be selected based on the difficulty level, power and relationship to clearly define the set of the specification. So this is the third principle. The psychological test should also include the information related to the scores, administering the scores, which will help in the different users at different situations, right? So how to administer the score. So that information also should be included in the psychological test. The next principle is the test manual as well as the accessory material should be provided along with the psychological test to guide a particular psychologist to administer the test, how to score, how to do the evaluation, how to interpret the particular result of the test. So a manual should be always there in the particular psychological test, which will aid the psychologist or psychiatrist to do the interpretation of the results. So these are the various principles that has to be followed when a psychological test is administered. Moving on to the uses of the psychological test. So what is the overall use of the psychological test? Number one is to get the information easily. So when we undergo a process of a psychological test, so we get certain kind of information from the client which you wouldn't have ventilated during the interview process. So through the psychological test also we will get some information. So it will aid in the process of data collection. The next thing is whatever the information is given, it is going to be scientifically right, and also it is reliable. So that is another use of the psychological test. The third use of it is it will help in the diagnosis process. Say for example, you give a personality test to the individual. Yes, the Rorschach's blood test for example. So that kind of a test will help the psychologist or psychiatrist in the diagnosis of the condition of the individual. The next is it will assist in the formation of psychopathology of a disease, right? So what is the reason why a person is ended up with the psychiatric condition? So the psychopathology of a condition can be assessed by administering the psychological test. For example, the thematic perception test. So here also we will get to know what is actually the reason why a person has underwent this condition. The next important function is it will help us to find out the severity of the disease condition, right? So how severe a person how severe the condition is in the client. So that can be elicited by doing the psychological test. Say for example, we have got to assess the depression, whether depression is mild, moderate, severe. So we have got the Hamilton's depression rating scale, okay, which is a psychological test which will be administered to the client to find out what degree of the depression the client is suffering from. So that is another important use of the psychological test. The next one is it will help to find out the general characteristic of an individual. To find out what is the overall personality of an individual, we can do the psychological test. The next function, the next use of the psychological test is it will assist in case of the forensic evaluation, in case of the family court, or in case of any kind of a criminal charges. So you have seen the criminals or any kind of a forensic evaluation. The criminal client or the the person will be subjected to the psychological test. So in those conditions, it will help the both the psychologist as well as the court to decide what is the situation of the client that he had committed the particular crime, and based on that, the sentence will be given to the client. It will also help to assess the level of disability. What is any kind of a disability that the person is, having? Okay, so what is the level of disability? Mental disability, it can be a physical disability, and what is the treatment that can be given for it, and what can be the outcome of the treatment? So all these can be done by administering the psychological tests. So let us see the limitations of psychological tests. Yes, we have got various uses, advantages we can say of the psychological test, but still we have got the limitations, or we can say the disadvantages of the psychological test. So what are those? So number one is many applicants or the clients will experience anxiety. Yes, and first time there is a client who is coming, okay, we administer psychological test. Obviously, any individual will be in a state of anxiety. So, because of the anxiety, because of the fear, whatever the responses that he may give may not be appropriate. So, it can also result in the false interpretation, right? So the many applicants will undergo a kind of a fear and anxiety when they are subjected to the psychological tests. The next thing is one can behave completely different than the original state of what he is, right? So whatever the information they give in the psychological test may be different than what he naturally is. So we cannot say that whatever the responses the client gives is completely right, right? So he may just pretend to give some false information or false responses. The next one is the negative attitude from the end of the client. So, if the client is having a negative attitude or is not willing to undergo the psychological test, so he is persuaded to do it. So, we cannot say that whatever the result we get is valid or not. So, validity of the test cannot be proven if the client is having a negative attitude towards the psychological test. The another important drawback of it is the administration and interpretation of the psychological test can only be done by a qualified psychologist, okay, one who are experienced, the psychologists who have underwent a proper degree in the proper degree in the field of clinical psychology, and they have been well experienced qualified experts only can do the administration as well as the interpretation of the results. So that is one of the drawback of the psychological test. Moving on to the important part, which is the role of a nurse in the psychological test. Yes, so it is not only the psychologist who is administering the psychological test that he has to know about these, principles or the procedure, but also the nurse. Very important, since the nurse is the one who is going to be with a patient for a longer period of time. She has to have a knowledge regarding the psychological test. Right. So, what is the role of nurse in administering the psychological test? has. Number one is she should have the knowledge about the various standards of the psychological tests. What are the various psychological tests? So for which condition, what type of psychological test can be administered? So she should have a basic knowledge about the standard of the psychological test. So when she has the knowledge about the various psychological tests, it will also help the nurse to clarify the doubts of the patients or the family members. So very much anxious or fearful they may be. We cannot say what may be the condition of the family or the client. Okay, so as a nurse, when she knows about the psychological test, she can educate the client and she can, clarify all the doubts that they have. The next important role is that there are many clients who are very much deficit in the developmental stages, right? So who have not crossed the particular milestone, who have not fulfilled the task of a particular developmental stage. So as a nurse, you need to identify what is the problem with the client in terms of the developmental stage, and also assist them to reach the developmental stage and move on to the higher developmental stage. So that is the overall nurse's responsibility in the psychological test. She can also assist the psychologist, the psychiatrist in the process of the administration of the psychological. Yes. So this is about the various psychological tests, how to administer, and what are the principles that has to be followed in the nurse's responsibilities. So hope you all have understood the topic.